Thank you, everyone, for joining this timely discussion. Our topic is: were the austerity policies imposed upon the Greek people necessary for Greece's economic recovery after the 2008 to 2009 crisis? We have with us two towering economists to shed light on this question. First, Milton Friedman, who will argue for the necessity of the austerity policies in Greece, given the circumstances. Second, John Kenneth Galbraith, who will argue against the necessity of austerity in Greece, suggesting alternative paths such as regaining monetary sovereignty. To start, I invite Milton Friedman to make his opening statement in support of the proposition that Greece's austerity measures were necessary for its economic recovery.
Thank you. Let me begin by setting the context. After the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, Greece faced a severe sovereign debt crisis. By 2009, Greece's budget deficit had swelled to around 15% of GDP, an unsustainable level. Public debt was spiraling, and Greece was effectively shut out of bond markets. In early 2010, the country was on the brink of defaulting on its obligations, threatening the stability of the entire Eurozone. Given this dire situation, I contend that the austerity policies, cuts in government spending, tax increases, and structural reforms were unfortunately necessary for Greece to stabilize its finances and remain in the Eurozone. Why? Because Greece no longer controlled its own currency. By joining the euro, Greece had thrown away the exchange rate adjustment mechanism that countries traditionally used to respond to economic shocks. In a pre-euro world, Greece could have devalued its national currency, the drachma, to regain competitiveness and inflate away some of the debt. But inside the euro, devaluation was no longer an option. The only way to correct the accumulated imbalances was through what economists call internal devaluation, essentially reducing costs, wages, and public spending internally. In plainer terms, austerity was the only tool left to restore balance given the constraints of the common currency. It's important to remember that by 2010 to 2015, Greece was dependent on financial rescue packages from the so-called Troika, the EU, European Central Bank, and IMF. Creditors like Germany made it explicit that continued support would require Greece to implement tough reforms and budget cuts. In 2015, at the peak of the crisis, there was even a proposal from Germany to suspend Greece from the euro if it did not agree to further austerity measures. In such a scenario, Greek leaders had virtually no choice but to comply with austerity conditions if they wished to avoid a chaotic currency exit and banking collapse. The austerity packages, painful as they were, unlocked vital bailout funds that kept the Greek state afloat and its banks supplied with liquidity. Critically, austerity also sent a signal to creditors and markets that Greece was serious about addressing its fiscal profligacy. By cutting a bloated public sector and reducing deficits, Greece aimed to regain trust and eventually return to economic growth on a more sustainable footing. And indeed, there were signs of stabilization after these measures. Greece's annual budget deficit, which I noted was about 15% of GDP in 2009, was brought down to nearly 3% by 2014. Remarkable fiscal improvement. This improvement was a key step toward what one might call a recovery, or at least a return to solvency. Make no mistake, the austerity path was difficult and came at a high social cost, something Professor Galbraith will no doubt emphasize. But from my perspective, given the constraints, membership in a common currency, and the looming threat of disorderly default, the Greek government's austere policies were a necessary bitter medicine. They were aimed at restoring fiscal credibility, preventing an even worse meltdown, and keeping Greece within the euro, which Greek society and its leaders overwhelmingly wanted at the time. In summary, while austerity is never pleasant, under the euro system Greece faced, it was the only viable route to long-term recovery and stability in the absence of a national currency to devalue.
Thank you, Professor Friedman. Now I turn to John Kenneth Galbraith for his opening statement against the necessity of those austerity policies.
Thank you. I appreciate the historical context Professor Friedman has laid out, but I arrive at a very different conclusion. In my view, the austerity policies imposed on Greece were not necessary for economic recovery. In fact, they were deeply counterproductive and inflicted enormous suffering on the Greek people. There were alternative paths that could have been taken, either earlier on or at the height of the crisis, which might have led to a swifter and less painful recovery. First, let's consider what austerity actually meant for Greece. Starting in 2010, Greece implemented wave after wave of spending cuts and tax hikes, slashing pensions and public salaries, raising taxes on goods, and so on. The result was a collapse in demand within Greece's economy. Over the austerity period, Greek GDP fell by about 26%, essentially a depression-level contraction. This was not a mild recession, it was a calamitous economic collapse. By some measures, Greece endured over 5 years of continuous recession. Unemployment skyrocketed from around 8% in 2008 to roughly 25% by 2014, with youth unemployment exceeding 50% at one point. 1 in 4 Greeks were out of work, and over 1/3 of the population fell below the poverty line by 2014. These numbers represent millions of individual tragedies, lost jobs, shuttered businesses, and shattered dreams. Employment fell and unemployment surged in Greece during the austerity years, reflecting the severe social impact of the crisis, 2004 to 2014. Importantly, this economic pain was not an inevitable act of nature. It was to a large extent the result of policy choices. Austerity measures directly withdrew spending power from the economy at the worst possible time, when Greece was already reeling from a downturn. It became a vicious circle. Cuts led to a deeper recession, which in turn made Greece's debt burden, as a percentage of GDP, even more unsustainable because the economy was shrinking. Indeed, the sharp fall in GDP worsened the debt-to-GDP ratio despite budget cut. To my mind, implementing harsh austerity in a depressed economy is like medieval bloodletting, draining a sick patient's blood in the misguided hope of curing them, only to leave them weaker. Professor Friedman argues that Greece had no choice but austerity, given Eurozone rules and creditor demands. It's true that those demands were made, but that doesn't mean the course was economically sound or necessary for recovery. I would argue Greece had alternative choices, all difficult, certainly, but perhaps less destructive than the prolonged austerity it endured. One alternative would have been to never enter the euro in the first place, or to suspend its membership, at least temporarily, during the crisis. Joining a currency union with stronger economies like Germany meant Greece surrendered its monetary sovereignty. They were, as one analyst put it, borrowing in a currency they did not control, which is a recipe for trouble. Lacking its own currency, Greece could not devalue to regain competitiveness or use independent monetary policy to cushion the downturn. If Greece had stayed on the drachma, it could have responded to the post-2008 slump by devaluing the drachma, boosting exports and tourism, and by using the central bank to finance deficits temporarily. Many countries in economic crises have followed that path of currency depreciation to recovery. In fact, history provides a powerful analogy: the Great Depression of the 1930s. Back then, countries on the gold standard, a fixed currency system, experienced similar constraints. They couldn't devalue their currencies freely. The countries that left the gold standard earlier, like Britain in 1931, generally recovered faster, whereas those that clung to gold, France, for example, suffered longer. In this analogy, the euro for Greece was like the gold standard, a rigid monetary straitjacket. I believe Greece would have been better off leaving the euro temporarily, or restructuring its debt decisively, rather than submitting to the Troika's austerity program. Yes, an exit, a Grexit, would have been chaotic in the short term. The currency would depreciate significantly, imports would become expensive, and the banking system would face turmoil. But Greece could then quickly restore competitiveness via a cheaper currency and regain control over monetary policy. After an initial shock, the economy might have begun growing again, as devaluation spurred exports and as Greece could set its own policies. We have seen other countries, like Argentina after its 2001 default and devaluation, or Iceland after 2008, which had its own currency, recover growth faster once they ditched untenable pegs or burdensome debt, rather than endure endless austerity. Let me also address the notion of no choice. It's often said that in 2015 Germany threatened to expel Greece from the euro if it didn't continue austerity. That was indeed the threat. But from Greece's perspective, this threat could be seen as leverage against the creditors. Essentially, yes, we will leave and you will suffer financial contagion unless you grant us better terms. The Greek government in 2015 did briefly take this stance. The people even voted no in a referendum to more austerity. Unfortunately, the Greek leadership then capitulated to even harsher terms, perhaps fearing the immediate consequences of exit. My contention is that enduring the hardship of austerity for a decade was worse than the alternative hardship of a euro exit followed by rebuilding. Austerity shattered Greece's society. Poverty, homelessness, a brain drain of young professionals leaving the country, and even negative public health outcomes, including spikes in depression and suicide. Was this truly necessary? I say no. It was the result of choices, particularly the choice to prioritize the Eurozone's continuity and creditors' balance sheets over the well-being of the Greek citizenry. In summary, Greece's recovery was delayed and diminished by austerity, not accelerated. A different policy mix, involving debt relief, investment, and, if needed, exit from the euro, could have set the stage for a more humane and faster recovery. Austerity was a policy of, there is no alternative imposed by creditors, but in reality, it inflicted avoidable damage. The Greek people suffered an economic depression inside the euro when, arguably, regaining their own currency or a radical debt restructuring might have shortened the pain. Thus, I firmly believe austerity was not a necessary path to recovery. It was a policy mistake that should not be repeated.
Thank you both for those illuminating opening remarks. Let's delve deeper into some points raised. Professor Friedman, you acknowledged the social cost of austerity. Critics say that the scale of Greece's recession and unemployment during 2010 to 2015 shows that austerity backfired, making recovery harder. How do you respond to the charge that austerity turned a bad situation into a catastrophe?
I certainly do not deny the severity of the downturn. The numbers speak for themselves, as Professor Galbraith recounted. However, I would clarify that Greece's economy was already heading into a deep contraction due to the bursting of its debt bubble. Austerity measures coincided with that contraction, and yes, likely amplified it in the short run. But we must consider the counterfactual scenario. What if Greece had not adopted austerity and simply kept spending and borrowing? In the absence of austerity, Greece would not magically have avoided pain. Rather, it might have faced an even more violent financial collapse. By 2010, no one was willing to lend to Greece at affordable rates. The government was literally running out of money. If they tried to stimulate instead the Keynesian prescription, they had no access to credit to fund that stimulus. The only lenders were the European institutions and IMF, and those came with conditions. Without those loans, Greece might have been forced to default outright, banks would have failed, and Greece might have been forced out of the euro in a disorderly way. That scenario could have meant an even sharper one-year collapse in GDP and chaotic social disruptions. Think of basic goods shortages due to an abrupt currency change, uncontrolled inflation with a new drachma, etc. In short, austerity traded a sharper immediate shock for a more drawn-out adjustment. It was a prolonged agony, I admit. But by 2016 to 2017, Greece's economy stopped contracting and returned to modest growth. The primary budget, which means government budget excluding interest payments, even moved into surplus during the later years of austerity, meaning Greece's day-to-day finances became sustainable. Those were prerequisites for any recovery. Indeed, by staying the course and remaining in the euro, Greece retained the benefits of a stable currency and eventually began to see investor confidence return. We should note that by 2014, before the political upheaval of 2015, there were signs of stabilization. A small positive growth rate, and Greece was able to raise funds for markets again. I would argue that was because of the credibility earned through hard reforms. To your broader question, was there a less painful way? Perhaps if the timing and composition of measures were different. In an ideal world, more of the adjustment burden would have been shared by Greece's creditors through debt relief, and by stronger Eurozone economies boosting demand. Some internal devaluation was unavoidable to correct Greece's previous loss of competitiveness. Greece's wages and prices had risen far more than Germany's within the euro's first decade. If not via austerity, those wage corrections would happen via massive inflation if Greece restored the drachma. Either way, Greek people would face a reduction in real purchasing power. So yes, austerity was painful, but I see it as part of the price for the earlier excesses and for the rigidities of the currency union. One must also consider that Greece's crisis was exacerbated by deep structural problems, an inefficient bureaucracy, widespread tax evasion, and corruption. Any path to recovery required tackling those as well. Austerity came with structural reform demands, for example, modernizing the tax system, reducing bureaucracy, liberalizing labor markets. These are reforms that, in the long run, could make Greece's economy more competitive and better governed. Without the external pressure of the crisis, Greek politics might never have confronted these difficult issues. As of 2017, there were signs of improvement. For instance, Greece's corruption index and tax collection marginally improved with reforms, though still a work in progress. So while austerity as implemented was far from perfect, I maintain that some form of drastic fiscal correction was necessary to lay the groundwork for a healthier economy. The suffering it caused is something no economist wants to see, but I believe the alternative scenarios entailed suffering of their own, possibly even worse in the short term.
Professor Galbraith, I'd like your response to that. Especially, could you address Professor Friedman's point that even if Greece had abandoned austerity, it lacked financing for any stimulus and would have faced chaos with a euro exit? Is it realistic to think Greece could have recovered without the aid that was conditional on austerity?
These are important questions. Let me first say that I agree with Professor Friedman on one aspect. Greece's situation was exceptionally difficult, and any path would have had serious costs. However, I dispute the notion that a disorderly default/exit would necessarily have been worse than what actually transpired. The Greek people experienced a Great Depression-level event under austerity. It's hard to imagine worse than a 25% GDP contraction and 25% unemployment for years on end. The counterfactual I propose is a scenario where Greece either forces a significant debt restructuring within the euro or, if rebuffed, chooses an orderly exit backed by international support. Consider debt restructuring. In 2012, there was indeed a partial restructuring. Private creditors took haircuts, but by then most Greek debt was owed to official European entities that refused to accept losses. The result is that Greece emerged with still an enormous debt load. The IMF itself admitted in retrospect that Greece's debt was unsustainable and that more relief was needed. If, back in 2010 or 2011, Greece and its European partners had squarely faced reality, they could have granted deep debt forgiveness, as was done for Germany after World War II, for example. With a lighter debt burden, Greece could have been allowed to run smaller primary surpluses or even deficits to support its economy, rather than extracting 10% of GDP in austerity each year to pay creditors. In other words, financing could have been provided without austerity attached, if the political will existed to prioritize Greek recovery over the principle of no bailouts without pain. This was a political choice. The European Central Bank showed in later years that it could stabilize government bond markets when it truly wanted to, through programs like OMT and quantitative easing. Had they done that for Greece early on, much of the panic could have been contained without forcing Greece into a downward spiral. Now, about the euro exit. It's often portrayed as unthinkable chaos, but countries have left currency pegs or unions in the past and managed. If planned properly, a temporary exit with support could work. For example, Greece could announce a new drachma at parity with the euro, impose capital controls during the transition. They had to impose those anyway in 2015 during the bank crisis, and redenominate domestic contracts in drachma. The drachma would devalue, perhaps significantly, 30 to 50%, which would be painful in terms of higher import prices and initially, financial turmoil. Yet that devaluation is essentially what internal austerity tried to accomplish by cutting wages. The difference is that with a devaluation, the adjustment is quicker and across the board, and growth can resume when exports and domestic industries become more competitive. We have evidence. As I mentioned, countries that shed currency constraints recovered faster in the 1930s. Iceland, after 2008, let its currency drop sharply, defaulted on foreign banks, and imposed capital controls. It had a severe crisis, but then bounced back to growth within a couple of years. Argentina's case in 2002 is instructive. It broke its peg to the dollar, a situation analogous to leaving a currency union, and defaulted on debt. Initially, Argentina's economy also fell hard, over 10% contraction in 1 year, but within 2 years, it was growing at 8 to 9% annually for a time, making up lost ground. By contrast, Greece under EU-imposed austerity kept shrinking year after year, only bottoming out after almost a decade and never recovering the pre-crisis income level fully. The lost decade for Greece was extraordinarily long. Is it realistic to think Greece could do this alone? Perhaps not easily. It would have required courageous leadership and contingency planning to introduce a new currency. It also would have required humanitarian support to ensure the supply of essential imports, fuel, medicine, during the transition. Here, the European partners and IMF could have played a constructive role by providing bridge loans or aid for essential goods if Greece took that route, basically helping one of their own member states back on its feet, rather than holding it underwater. Unfortunately, European leaders in 2010 to 2015 were terrified that forgiving Greece or allowing exit would set a precedent for other countries. They were worried about moral hazard and political backlash at home. So, they chose to make Greece a kind of example, insisting on strict austerity to discourage others from fiscal misbehavior. That, to me, was a grave moral failure, putting abstract principles above human welfare. One more point. Professor Friedman mentions needed structural reforms in Greece, and I don't disagree that Greece had deep governance issues, tax evasion, bureaucratic inefficiency. However, reforms need not be tied to fiscal austerity. You can modernize tax collection or streamline regulations while pursuing policies that support jobs and growth. In fact, harsh austerity arguably made some structural problems worse. For example, tax revenues plunged more than expected in the recession because people had less income to tax and perhaps more incentive to evade in a shrinking economy, which in turn undermined the fiscal goals. There's evidence that the scale of austerity became self-defeating. Greece's debt ratio worsened as GDP collapsed, and even the IMF admitted to underestimating the recessionary effect of austerity. This is a classic Keynesian point. Cutting spending in a slump can shrink the economy so much that even the fiscal position doesn't improve as intended. I would argue that a more gradual adjustment or a stimulus for growth, alongside anti-corruption measures, would have served Greece better. So to wrap up the answer, yes, Greece needed financing and a plan, but austerity was not the only plan. The necessary elements for recovery would have been debt relief, currency flexibility, and investment, not a decade of strangulation. The tragedy is that Europe's institutions only recognized some of these truths very late. Greece eventually did get some debt relief measures, like extended maturities, and the ECB eventually supported Greek bonds, but only after unimaginable damage was done. This, in my view, demonstrates that the extent of austerity imposed was not necessary and certainly not inevitable.
Thank you. It seems the crux of your disagreement lies in whether remaining within the euro and restoring fiscal order, via austerity, was better than the alternative of regaining monetary independence at the cost of short-term chaos. Before we conclude, I'd like to touch on one more aspect: the political and long-term economic legacy. Greece did stay in the euro and has now returned to growth, though it's still not back to pre-crisis levels in many respects. Some argue that despite the pain, Greece is now on a sounder footing. Its budget is closer to balance, and it has implemented reforms it long avoided. Others say that the austerity has left lasting scars: higher debt to GDP, a smaller workforce due to emigration, and public distrust. Professor Friedman, do you believe that Greece's future prospects inside the euro are now brighter because it went through this adjustment? And Professor Galbraith, do you think Greece would have been better off in the long run if it had parted ways with the euro during the crisis?
I would say Greece's long-term prospects within the euro are cautiously brighter now, provided that the hard lessons of the crisis are taken to heart. Greece today has a much reduced structural deficit and has learned, the very hard way, the importance of fiscal prudence. The economy has rebalanced to some degree. For instance, the current account deficit trade imbalance shrank dramatically after 2010, meaning Greece isn't living as far beyond its means as it was. Being in the euro, Greece continues to benefit from lower inflation and borrowing costs than it would likely have with a volatile drachma. If Greece can maintain responsible policies, it can attract investment and grow. The Eurozone, for its part, has set up mechanisms like the European Stability Mechanism and some banking union reforms that might manage future crises better. One could argue Greece has emerged as a more disciplined economy. Painful as that process was, it might prevent repeats of such a crisis. That said, I remain, as I was in life, somewhat skeptical of the euro's structure. I famously predicted it could be a source of great trouble, and indeed it was for Greece. If the underlying structural issues aren't fixed, such as Europe's lack of a fiscal union or transfer system to buffer asymmetric shocks, then countries like Greece might face similar hardships in a future downturn. My hope is that the Greek episode has spurred some institutional learning. But if not, then I fear the choices Greece faced, austerity, within versus exit, could confront other countries down the line. In summary, Greece has recovered modestly now while staying in the euro. And if it continues reforms, and if the Eurozone becomes more flexible, the worst may be behind it. The cost was enormous, but Greece did avoid some unknown hazards of exit. Only history will judge whether it was worth it. From a technocratic view, I think the adjustment has at least put Greece on a more solid baseline to build upon. Low deficits, a more competitive wage level, etc. The key is that the sacrifice should not be in vain. It needs to be followed by smart growth policies at the European level as well, to ensure prosperity returns.
I remain deeply concerned about Greece's long-term health after what it went through. The austerity decade has indeed shrunk Greece's economy in a lasting way. It's as if a portion of a generation's output was just lost. The productive capacity might be lower now, partly because so many young, educated Greeks left the country to find jobs abroad during the crisis. This brain drain is hard to reverse and means Greece's future growth could be weaker. Public infrastructure and services were starved of investment for years, which may have lasting effects on human capital and productivity. Had Greece left the euro and recovered, I suspect by now, 2025, it might have regained more of its lost ground. We can't know for sure. An exit could also have had unpredictable consequences, but consider that debt forgiveness usually helps a country bounce back, and currency flexibility helps regain competitiveness. Greece stayed and ultimately got only partial debt relief and no currency flexibility. As a result, its debt to GDP is still about 170%, extraordinarily high, and it must continually run tight budgets to service that. So the legacy is a heavy burden that could constrain public investment for years to come. Politically, the trauma of austerity has fueled populism and mistrust in Greece's institutions and the EU. While Greece remains in the Union, the social fabric was stretched thin. We saw the rise of extremist parties, a shock referendum, and then a sense of humiliation when the referendum result against austerity was essentially overridden. Democracy took a hit in that process, in my view, as external technocrats dictated key policies. That kind of scar doesn't bode well for the future unless there is serious reflection and reform at the European level. To answer directly, yes, I believe Greece may have been better off long term if, back in 2010 or 2015, it had said, "We need a fresh start, we will restructure our debt profoundly and if necessary leave the euro to reclaim control of our destiny." The short-term pain would have been intense, but possibly shorter in duration. By now, a decade later, Greece might have had a lower debt ratio, a restored currency, maybe even it could have repegged or rejoined the euro at a more realistic rate, and a population that didn't endure 10 years of depression. We must remember that economics is not just about numbers, it's about people's lives. The aim of economic policy is to improve living standards. In Greece's case, the policies adopted caused a humanitarian crisis in a developed country, something almost unthinkable in modern Europe. That, to me, indicates a fundamentally wrong approach. However, I will acknowledge, the euro is a political project as much as an economic one. The Greek people, in opinion polls, consistently wished to stay in the euro, even at high cost. There was and is a pride in being part of Europe's single currency, a hope that it anchors Greece in a modern, stable European identity. Perhaps that political value was deemed worth the economic cost. Reasonable people can differ on that. But strictly economically, I will conclude that the austerity was far too severe to label it necessary. A more moderate path could have been pursued within the euro, with more help and less austerity, or a more radical departure could have reset the economy faster. The path chosen was one of prolonged attrition. Going forward, I dearly hope the Eurozone learns to allow more flexibility, whether that means financial support without punitive austerity, or mechanisms for countries to adjust, even exit and re-enter if needed, without catastrophe. If not, then we've not truly solved the underlying problem that Greece exemplified.
Thank you, Professor Friedman and Professor Galbraith, for your thoughtful insights. This respectful exchange has helped clarify why reasonable people, even great economists, can disagree on whether Greece's austerity was a painful necessity or a tragic mistake. I hope our audience leaves with a better understanding of the complexities involved and the lessons that can be drawn for the future of Europe and economic policy in crisis situations.